In the winter of 1099, as Jerusalem burned and Crusader banners bled into the dust, a rumor spread that a secret was carried out of the city not in gold or relics, but in bloodlines and names whispered only at night. Why would victors hide instead of proclaim? Why would monks erase instead of record? Why would kings vanish from chronicles as if deliberately removed? Why does the official story of Christianity feel polished smooth, as though something rough and dangerous was sanded away? Why do the same forbidden names resurface across centuries, always half seen, never fully explained? Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. In 1975, inside the quiet depths of France's National Archive, a discovery emerged that did not announce itself with spectacle. There were no trumpets, no scholars shouting in triumph, only folders pulled from shelves where paper had slowly yellowed under decades of indifference. The room smelled of dust and binding glue, the smell of time stored rather than lived. Yet within those folders lay a narrative so explosive that it would eventually shake the faith of millions who would never set foot in that library. The documents claimed that history itself had been curated, edited, and quietly bent by hands operating far from public view. The papers appeared ordinary at first glance. Genealogical charts branching like winter trees, medieval-style letters written in careful, archaic hands, lists of names accompanied by dates and titles. But together they formed a story that felt almost too complete. According to these records, a secret organization called the Priory of Sion had existed since the end of the First Crusade, founded in Jerusalem in 1099 by a Crusader noble who vanished from official history soon after. Its purpose, the documents claimed, was not political conquest or religious reform, but guardianship. Not of gold or relics, but of a truth so destabilizing that it could unravel the foundations of Western Christianity. That truth was simple in its phrasing and catastrophic in its implications. Jesus of Nazareth had not died childless. He had been married, the papers insisted, to Mary Magdalene, and their descendants had survived, protected generation after generation, by a hidden network of loyalists. These descendants, the documents claimed, became the Merovingian kings of early medieval France, a dynasty remembered today mostly as shadowy figures with long hair and brutal customs. In this version of history, their royal blood was not symbolic but literal, carrying the lineage of Christ himself. What made the documents so persuasive was not just their claims, but their texture. The paper was old, the ink faded unevenly, as if absorbed slowly over centuries. Wax seals bore marks consistent with medieval techniques, slightly asymmetrical, imperfect in ways modern forgeries often forget to imitate. References were made to real chronicles, real monasteries, real figures from European history. It felt less like a single revelation and more like the accidental exposure of something that had always been there, overlooked rather than invented. As researchers began to cross-check the references, they found something unsettling. Many citations pointed to other archives, other collections. When they followed those leads, they often found corroborating material. A marginal note in one chronicle echoed a claim in another. A genealogy in a provincial archive aligned neatly with a lineage chart found in Paris. Each discovery reinforced the sense that this was not the work of a single hoaxer, but the residue of a long-sustained secret. At the center of this web, one name appeared repeatedly, sometimes subtly, sometimes boldly: Pierre Plantard. In the documents, he was described not as an author or compiler, but as a descendant, the latest bearer of a bloodline that had survived assassinations, church purges, and deliberate historical erasure. According to the files, he was the rightful heir to a sacred lineage, living quietly in modern France while the world unknowingly passed him by. Outside the documents, Plantard was almost painfully ordinary. Born in Paris in 1920, he came from a working-class family with no verifiable noble ancestry. His early life showed no sign of destiny, only ambition. He drifted through jobs, tried and failed to launch political and religious movements, and nursed a fascination with monarchy and secret orders that bordered on obsession. To those who knew him casually, he seemed like a dreamer with a taste for grand narratives. To those who later studied him closely, he appeared as something far more complex. The genius of the documents lay not only in what they claimed, but in how they were positioned. They were not announced as a revelation. They were not published as a manifesto. They were simply placed quietly into one of the most authoritative repositories of knowledge in Europe. In the human mind, location confers legitimacy. A document found in a national archive carries an unspoken promise. Someone else has already verified this. The mere presence of these files among authentic records lent them a credibility no self-published work could ever achieve. As the story spread beyond academic circles, it began to mutate. Writers, journalists, and independent researchers took the raw material and layered interpretation upon interpretation. The Priory of Sion became not just a guardian of bloodlines, but a hidden hand guiding European history. It was said to have influenced wars, shaped revolutions, and quietly steered the church itself. The list of its alleged leaders grew to include names that glittered with cultural authority: artists, scientists, poets, figures whose genius seemed to demand an explanation beyond talent alone. What made the narrative irresistible was its structure. It offered an alternative to the randomness of history. Genius was no longer accidental. It was curated. Power was no longer chaotic. It was managed. Even faith itself became part of a longer, hidden storyline, one in which official doctrine was only the surface layer, concealing deeper truths accessible only to the initiated. In this version of the world, confusion was not evidence of meaninglessness, but proof of design. Yet beneath the elegance of the story, fractures began to appear. Dates that aligned too neatly, titles used anachronistically, medieval figures credited with roles that conflicted subtly with what was known from primary sources. These were not obvious errors, but the kind that emerge when imagination stretches just far enough to brush against reality without fully mastering it. To believers, these inconsistencies were easily dismissed. Secrets, after all, are rarely tidy. To skeptics, they were warning signs. What complicates the story is that not everything in it was false. The Merovingians were real, strange kings whose rule blended pagan symbolism with early Christianity. Medieval Europe was full of secretive brotherhoods, sworn to silence, bound by ritual and shared belief. Archives are imperfect, shaped by loss, fire, and deliberate destruction. History genuinely contains gaps large enough for entire lives to vanish. The documents exploited these truths, weaving fiction through them like ivy through stone. By the late 20th century, the idea of the Priory of Sion had escaped the archive entirely. It lived now in books, documentaries, late-night conversations, and eventually in global popular culture. It invited people to look at familiar symbols and feel that they were missing something crucial. Churches became riddles, paintings became codes, and history itself became a puzzle designed to be solved rather than understood. Whether the priory ever existed became almost secondary. What mattered was that the story satisfied a deep hunger. It offered meaning where institutions had failed, mystery where explanations felt thin, and a sense of initiation in a world that often feels flat and overexposed. The documents did not just challenge history, they challenged the authority of those who claim to tell it. And somewhere between the dust of the archives and the glow of modern screens, a question quietly took root, refusing to be buried. If one man could insert a story into history so convincingly that it fooled scholars and captivated millions, how many other narratives had been shaped the same way, only more successfully? Pierre Plantard did not begin his life as a master deceiver, surrounded by ancient parchments and whispered legends. He began as a boy growing up in Paris between two wars, the son of a butler and a housewife, surrounded not by castles but by narrow streets and ordinary routines. Yet even as a child, he showed an unusual hunger for elevation, a desire to step out of the role history had assigned him. He read historical novels the way others read maps, not for entertainment, but for escape, imagining himself not as an observer of greatness, but as its rightful heir. In his teenage years, this longing began to take shape. He joined a Catholic scouting movement that emphasized medieval symbolism, ritual gestures, and knightly ideals, a romantic reconstruction of chivalry designed to discipline young men through myth. The uniforms, the oaths, the ceremonies lit something in him. Titles mattered, hierarchies mattered, being chosen mattered. Long before he forged documents, he learned that belief is born not from proof, but from performance. At 17, he founded his first organization, a self-declared order devoted to the restoration of monarchy in France. The group was small, almost comically so, consisting mostly of friends and acquaintances, but it had statutes, ranks, insignia, and a printed bulletin. The scale was insignificant, but the structure was grand. This pattern would repeat throughout his life. Plantard did not need followers in large numbers. He needed the framework of authority, the illusion that something ancient and important was already in motion. When war arrived, the tone darkened. During the German occupation of France, Plantard did not join the resistance, a fact his later admirers would prefer to forget. Instead, he registered another organization, this time with the approval of the Vichy government, the collaborationist regime that administered occupied France. The group wrapped mystical language around nationalist ideas, blending spirituality and politics in ways that echoed the atmosphere of the time. Whether motivated by ideology, opportunism, or survival, Plantard once again demonstrated his instinct for aligning myth with power. After the war, such associations became liabilities. He was arrested briefly on charges related to fraud and misrepresentation, accused of claiming titles and honors he did not possess. Witnesses recalled him presenting himself as nobility, using elaborate names and invented lineages. The punishment was mild, but the lesson was severe. Borrowed titles could be challenged. Self-invention without documentation could be dismantled. If he wanted legitimacy that could not be easily stripped away, he needed something older, something tangled enough to resist verification. This was when his thinking shifted. Instead of claiming honor, he would inherit it. Instead of inventing a title, he would uncover a lineage. In the decades after the war, France experienced a strange cultural mood. The trauma of occupation had shattered trust in institutions. Traditional authority felt compromised. At the same time, interest in esoteric knowledge surged. Alchemy, secret societies, and medieval orders returned to bookstores and salons, not as superstition, but as alternatives to a rational world that had failed catastrophically. Plantard understood this instinctively. People were no longer impressed by new movements. They were captivated by forgotten ones. A newly founded order sounded absurd. An ancient one, rediscovered, felt inevitable. In 1956, he registered an organization under the name Priory of Sion in a small town near the Swiss border. Officially, it was a harmless association devoted to housing issues and local interests. Unofficially, it was the seed of something far larger. For years, nothing happened publicly. This silence was not neglect. It was incubation. Plantard began assembling a past, rather than a future. He collected references, studied medieval genealogies, learned how historians argued with one another through footnotes and marginalia. He discovered that history is not a monolith, but a patchwork of fragments stitched together with educated guesses. Where evidence was thin, imagination could hide comfortably. Around this time, he encountered Philippe de Chérisey, a minor aristocrat with a fading title and an intimate familiarity with old documents. Where Plantard had vision, de Chérisey had technique. He understood parchment, ink, handwriting styles, and the subtle imperfections that distinguish a living document from a manufactured one. More importantly, he had access. Aristocratic libraries, family archives, uncatalogued collections passed down more through habit than oversight. Together, they began to manufacture a trail rather than a single forgery. A lone fake document can be exposed. A network of mutually reinforcing ones feels organic. They produced genealogies that linked real historical figures to invented descendants, letters that referenced other letters, and lists that pointed elsewhere. Each piece was incomplete on its own, but persuasive in combination. The most daring aspect of their strategy was placement. They did not publish these documents under their own names. Instead, they deposited them into archives, quietly and patiently, mixing them among authentic materials. In massive institutions like the French National Library, which houses millions of documents, not every item is scrutinized with forensic intensity. Archivists catalog what they receive. They do not assume malice. Once a document is indexed, it acquires institutional gravity. By the early 1970s, the groundwork was laid. The Priory of Sion now appeared to leave traces across centuries. References emerged in unexpected places. Names reappeared in different contexts. The illusion of depth was complete. When the so-called secret dossiers surfaced, they did not feel like a revelation, but like a confirmation of something scholars had simply overlooked. What makes Plantard's story unsettling is not just that he fooled people, but how easily the deception aligned with human psychology. He did not invent desires, he mirrored them. The need to believe that history has a hidden order, that chaos conceals intention, that greatness is inherited rather than accidental, runs deep. The Priory narrative offered a world where randomness was an illusion, and where certain people mattered because they always had. Plantard himself seemed to drift between awareness and belief. He knew the documents were manufactured, yet he behaved as though the identity they granted him was real. Psychologists describe this as a constructed self, a personality built to compensate for perceived insignificance. The invented lineage was not merely a lie told to others, it was a truth he rehearsed until it felt earned. By the time researchers began questioning the story seriously, it had already escaped his control. Others expanded it, elaborated it, and embedded it in new contexts. Books were written. Connections multiplied. The myth no longer needed its creator. It had become self-sustaining. And so the story of the Priory of Sion is not only about deception, it is about the fragile boundary between history and storytelling, about how easily authority can be manufactured when it is wrapped in age, ritual, and the promise of hidden meaning. It reveals less about the past than about the present, about the kind of truths people are willing to accept when the official ones feel insufficient. The strength of the Priory of Sion legend did not come from a single lie, but from an architecture of lies arranged with almost scholarly care. To understand how it persuaded so many intelligent people, it is necessary to step inside the workshop where the illusion was assembled, into the slow, meticulous process through which false history was made to feel older than truth. This was not the work of haste or desperation. It was the work of patience, of someone who understood that time itself could be imitated. Imagine a modest Paris apartment in the 1950s, far removed from the grandeur of medieval scriptoria or aristocratic estates. On a plain wooden table lay tools that belonged more to the past than the present. Glass inkwells, metal nibs, magnifying lenses, and stacks of paper whose yellowed edges had been softened by decades, sometimes centuries, of existence. These were not newly purchased sheets. They were scavenged from forgotten books, discarded legal documents, unused end papers torn carefully from antique volumes. The paper was genuinely old, and that single fact would protect everything written upon it. Modern paper betrays itself easily. Its fibers are uniform, its chemicals traceable to industrial processes that did not exist before the 19th century. Old paper, by contrast, breathes irregularity. It contains cotton or linen fibers beaten by hand, sized with animal glue, marked with watermarks, pressed by wire molds. Under laboratory analysis, such paper confirms its age without hesitation. By writing new words on old paper, the forger collapses centuries into a single surface. Ink presented a more subtle challenge. Medieval and early modern inks were often made from oak galls, iron salts, and organic binders. As they age, they darken, spread, and sometimes corrode the paper itself. Modern ink sits on the surface too cleanly, too confidently. To replicate the behavior of historical ink, one must understand chemistry as much as calligraphy. Recipes were studied, tested, discarded, refined. Ratios mattered. Temperature mattered. Even the humidity of the room could alter how ink bit into the page. In some cases, the solution was even simpler and more audacious. Old ink still existed, dried and forgotten inside antique inkwells. With careful rehydration, it could be coaxed back into use. Writing with ink that had already aged for a century produced marks that no modern simulation could fully replicate. Time itself became a collaborator in the deception. Handwriting was the most demanding discipline of all. Every era has its own visual rhythm, its own unspoken rules about how letters lean, how they connect, where a scribe hesitates. Medieval hands were not uniform. They varied by region, by century, by purpose. Legal documents used compressed, formal scripts designed to deter alteration. Personal letters flowed more freely, full of idiosyncrasies. To fake handwriting convincingly, one must also fake the mistakes of the period, the habitual abbreviations, the corrections made mid-word, the small ink blots left by tired hands. Too perfect a document arouses suspicion. Authentic texts contain human error. The forger must therefore perform imperfection convincingly, placing flaws where a real scribe would have faltered. This requires not only technical skill, but empathy for the dead, an ability to inhabit the mental world of someone writing by candlelight centuries earlier. Yet documents alone could not carry the weight of the myth. They needed context, and that context came in the form of genealogy. Tracing a family line back a few generations is straightforward. Church records, birth registries, marriage contracts provide continuity. Beyond a certain point, however, the record fractures. Wars destroy archives. Fires erase monasteries. Names change spelling. Individuals disappear into silence. The further back one goes, the more history becomes suggestion rather than certainty. These fractures were not obstacles, they were entry points. By anchoring a fictional lineage to real historical figures whose descendants were poorly documented, it became possible to extend the line invisibly. A known king with a son of uncertain fate becomes the root of an entirely invented branch. Once that branch enters a period historians call the Dark Ages, verification becomes nearly impossible. Absence of evidence transforms into narrative freedom. To reinforce these genealogies, supporting references were manufactured. A name appears briefly in a chronicle. Another is mentioned in a marginal note. None are central figures. All are peripheral enough to escape scrutiny. Each reference seems trivial, but together they create density. Historians are trained to trust patterns. When a name recurs across independent sources, it gains weight. The illusion depended on ensuring that no single document carried the full claim. Truth, or what looked like it, emerged only when fragments were assembled. Placement was the final and most audacious step. Archives are temples of trust. Scholars assume that documents housed there have passed through filters of legitimacy. By inserting fabricated materials into these collections, the forgers exploited that trust. Once catalogued, a document inherits the authority of its surroundings. It does not need to persuade on its own. It borrows credibility from the institution itself. This strategy created a closed system of evidence. One document cited another. That second document referenced a third, housed elsewhere. Researchers following these trails encountered confirmation at every turn, unaware that all roads led back to the same small circle of creators. The very act of verification became part of the deception. Psychologically, this structure was devastatingly effective. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We assume complexity arises from accumulation, not orchestration. When evidence appears distributed across time and space, conspiracy seems less likely than authenticity. The idea that someone could plant corroborating lies in multiple archives feels almost implausible, which is precisely why it worked. By the time doubts emerged, The narrative had already embedded itself into popular imagination. It no longer relied on documents alone. It lived in interpretations of art, in speculative readings of architecture, in whispered suggestions that great minds left clues behind. The physical evidence could be challenged, but the feeling of hidden coherence remained. The Priory of Sion myth demonstrates a disturbing truth about historical knowledge. History is not merely what happened, it is what survives, what is preserved, and what is believed. Archives do not contain the past itself, only its residue. When that residue is manipulated skillfully, belief can precede verification. What Plantard and his collaborators revealed, perhaps unintentionally, is that authority is fragile. It rests not on certainty, but on accumulated trust. Once that trust is breached, the distinction between discovery and invention becomes dangerously thin. In that space, myths do not merely imitate history. They compete with it, offering narratives that feel deeper, more intentional, and more satisfying than reality ever was. To give the illusion of antiquity real weight, the legend required a dynasty that already lived halfway between history and myth. The Merovingians provided exactly that terrain, a royal line emerging from the collapse of Roman order, ruling through blood, violence, and symbols that felt older than Christianity itself. Their story was fragmented, contradictory, and filled with gaps large enough to absorb almost any interpretation. For a mythmaker, they were not just suitable, they were perfect. The dynasty takes its name from Merovech, a figure who stands at the edge of legend rather than firmly within recorded history. Medieval chroniclers could not agree on his origin. Some described him as a Frankish war leader, others as something stranger. One account claimed his mother conceived him after encountering a mysterious sea creature while bathing. A story that sounds absurd today, but carried symbolic meaning in an early medieval world. Such myths were not meant to be literal biology, but declarations of difference, a way of saying this bloodline did not originate like ordinary men. From the beginning, Merovingian kings cultivated the idea that their authority was physical, almost magical. Their long hair was not a fashion choice, but a symbol of sacred power. Chroniclers called them the long-haired kings, and to cut a Merovingian's hair was to strip him of legitimacy. Hair, in early Germanic culture, represented vitality and divine favor. A shorn king was a dead king, politically speaking. Rivals understood this well. Several claimants were neutralized not by execution, but by forced tonsure, a ritual humiliation that ended their right to rule without spilling blood. The most famous of the Merovingians, Clovis I, ruled at the turn of the 6th century and changed the trajectory of Europe. He united Frankish tribes through warfare and strategic marriage, then made a decision whose consequences still echo. He converted to Christianity, aligning himself with the Roman Church rather than the Arian Christianity practiced by many neighboring rulers. This alliance granted him legitimacy in the eyes of Roman elites and bishops, but it did not erase older beliefs. The Merovingian court continued to blend Christian ritual with pre-Christian symbolism, creating a form of kingship that felt both holy and unsettling. This dual identity is crucial. The Merovingians were Christian enough to anchor a religious narrative, yet pagan enough to suggest access to forbidden knowledge. They occupied a liminal space, neither fully sanctified nor fully condemned. For later mythmakers, this ambiguity invited reinterpretation. If a secret survived within Christianity, hidden beneath doctrine, who better to carry it than kings who never fully surrendered their older power? As generations passed, the Merovingians retained the crown, but gradually lost control. Real authority shifted to officials known as mayors of the palace, administrators who managed armies and finances, while the kings became ceremonial figures. Chroniclers, often aligned with the rising powers, dismissed the later Merovingians as do-nothing kings, lazy and decadent. Whether this portrait was fair or politically motivated remains debated, but its effect was clear. When the dynasty fell, few mourned. In 751, Pepin the Short, a mayor of the palace, deposed the last Merovingian king and confined him to a monastery. With papal approval, Pepin crowned himself, founding the Carolingian dynasty. Official history presents this transition as orderly and justified. The old kings were weak, the new ruler was strong. Yet beneath the surface, the removal of a royal bloodline sanctified by tradition was an act of profound disruption. Most Merovingians disappeared into obscurity, some executed, others forced into religious life. Their lineage, according to conventional history, ended quietly. But one figure refused to remain quiet, at least in legend. Dagobert II, a 7th-century king of Austrasia, embodied everything that made the dynasty fertile ground for conspiracy. Dagobert was sent into exile as a child, smuggled away to Ireland during a period of political turmoil. Ireland at the time was both Christian and independent of Rome, home to monasteries that preserved learning while continental Europe struggled. There, Dagobert received an education that combined theology, classical knowledge, and kingship. Decades later, he returned and reclaimed his throne, a living reminder that Merovingian blood still carried authority. His reign was brief. In 679, while hunting in the Ardennes forest, Dagobert was killed, allegedly by a trusted associate. Contemporary accounts hint at betrayal, suggesting his death benefited those who preferred kings without power. The assassin reportedly found refuge with the very officials who stood to gain from Dagobert's removal. History recorded the event, but not its consequences. According to official accounts, Dagobert's son, Sigebert, died soon after, ending that branch of the dynasty. Yet later, chronicles introduced uncertainty. Some suggested the child survived, hidden by loyal supporters and spirited away to the south of France. These accounts emerged centuries later and are treated cautiously by historians, but their existence matters more than their accuracy. They introduced doubt. And doubt is the seed from which alternative histories grow. For Pierre Plantard, this ambiguity was an invitation. In his version, Sigebert did not die. He was protected by a secret order formed specifically to preserve Merovingian blood. The child grew up in obscurity, his descendants intermarrying, changing names, vanishing into rural regions where records were sparse. Over centuries, the bloodline thinned but endured, invisible yet intact, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. This narrative did not need proof. It needed plausibility. Southern France, particularly regions like Languedoc, had long been associated with religious dissent, hidden communities, and resistance to centralized authority. The idea that a royal lineage could hide there felt emotionally true, even if historically unverified. Geography became evidence. Plantard reinforced the story through symbols. Merovingian bees, discovered in Clovis's tomb, became recurring motifs. Bees, ancient symbols of resurrection and continuity, suggested a lineage that never truly dies. By adopting such imagery, Plantard aligned himself visually with the kings he claimed as ancestors, allowing symbolism to stand where documentation could not. The brilliance of using the Merovingians lay in their distance. They were ancient enough to resist scrutiny, strange enough to invite speculation, and obscure enough that few people felt confident correcting the narrative. They became less a historical dynasty and more a mythic template onto which any secret could be projected. In this way, the Merovingians were transformed. No longer barbarian kings navigating a collapsing world, they became guardians of a sacred truth, vessels of divine blood, casualties of a church that could not tolerate what they represented. History was not rewritten so much as overlaid, a second image placed atop the first, visible only to those who believed they knew how to look. A myth, no matter how elaborate, requires a physical anchor. It must touch the earth somewhere, settle into stone and soil, so that believers can stand where the secret supposedly stood. For the legend of the Priory of Sion, that anchor became a small, wind-swept village in southern France, perched on a hill like an afterthought of geography. Rennes-le-Château had no strategic importance, no grand ruins, no dramatic history that distinguished it from hundreds of other rural settlements. And yet, by the end of the 20th century, it would become one of the most obsessively examined locations in Europe. The story begins not in the Middle Ages, but in 1891, when a young priest named Berger Saunière arrived to take charge of the parish. He was 33, from a peasant background, and ambitious in a quiet, stubborn way. The church he inherited was old and neglected, its stones cracked, its roof failing. The parish was poor, the salary barely enough to live on. Nothing about the appointment suggested destiny. It was the kind of posting given to men expected to disappear politely into obscurity. Then something changed. Within a few years, Saunière began spending money on a scale that made no sense. He restored the church with unusual flair, installing new decorations, commissioning statues, repainting interiors. He built himself a villa, landscaped gardens, erected a tower, installed running water and electricity. Over roughly 2 decades, he spent the equivalent of millions in modern currency. In a village where poverty was the norm, this transformation felt miraculous. Naturally, rumors followed. Parishioners whispered. Church authorities investigated. Saunière claimed donations from wealthy benefactors, but names were vague, explanations inconsistent. Eventually, the diocese accused him of trafficking in masses, a practice in which priests accepted money to say prayers for the dead, far beyond what they could realistically perform. It was a common abuse at the time, and it explained the income without invoking mystery. Saunière was found guilty by church courts and suspended. He died in 1917, disgraced but wealthy. On the surface, the story ended there. A priest exploited a system and paid the price. But decades later, Pierre Plantard reopened the narrative and rewrote its meaning entirely. In his version, Saunière had not found money. He had found knowledge. According to the Priory legend, while renovating the church, Saunière discovered hidden parchments embedded within a hollow pillar beneath the altar. These documents, allegedly medieval in origin, contained coded messages revealing the survival of the Merovingian bloodline and the location of a secret long protected by the priory. Saunière, ignorant at first of their importance, took them to Paris, where experts deciphered their meaning. Once he understood what he possessed, the legend claimed, powerful forces intervened, paying him for silence. To support this narrative, forged copies of the supposed parchments appeared. They were filled with uneven lettering, irregular spacing, and highlighted characters that, when rearranged, produced cryptic phrases. The messages pointed outward, referencing artists, symbols, dates, and locations that encouraged endless interpretation. One phrase, allegedly decoded, became famous for its theatrical obscurity, suggesting hidden guardians, sacred peace, and a time marked by the number 681. Meaning was always implied, never stated. The genius of this approach lay in its restraint. The documents did not explain themselves. They hinted. They invited the reader to participate, to feel clever for seeing patterns others had missed. Every ambiguity became an opportunity for elaboration. Rennes-le-Château itself was transformed into a text to be read. Visitors scrutinized the church decorations installed by Saunière. A statue of a demon holding the holy water font drew particular attention. In medieval lore, such a figure was sometimes associated with guarding treasure. For believers, this was not decoration, but confession, a signal left by a man who could not speak openly. The inscription above the church entrance, a Latin phrase from the Book of Genesis meaning, "This place is terrible," was reinterpreted as a warning rather than a biblical quotation. Paintings, floor tiles, even the orientation of the building were examined for alignment with celestial events or nearby landmarks. The surrounding landscape became a map layered with invisible geometry, lines drawn between hills, graves, and ancient ruins. Every coincidence was elevated to intention. Yet the historical record tells a quieter story. Saunière's finances, when examined carefully, match the profile of mass trafficking almost perfectly. He corresponded with thousands of people across France, soliciting payments. Records show orders for masses far beyond human capacity. His lover, who managed his accounts, came from a family with land and resources, further complicating the myth of sudden discovery. No credible evidence places ancient parchments in his possession before the 20th century. But facts struggled to compete with atmosphere. Rennes-le-Château offered something tangible that documents alone could not. A place where imagination could roam freely. Visitors could stand in the church, feel the weight of stone, look out over the valley, and sense that something might have happened there. Tourism flourished, bookstores appeared, guided tours narrated secrets with practiced gravity. The village became a stage set for a story larger than itself. What made Rennes-le-Château indispensable to the Priory myth was not proof, but plausibility. It felt right. A hidden truth, if it existed, would hide somewhere forgotten. A poor priest, if chosen by fate, would discover it by accident. Wealth gained mysteriously feels more meaningful than wealth earned through exploitation. The narrative satisfied emotional logic, even as it violated historical rigor. Plantard understood this instinctively. By tying his lineage to a place people could visit, he grounded abstraction in geography. The Merovingians became more than names in a chart. They became ghosts haunting a hillside. The priory became more than a concept. It became something that might still be watching. In the end, Rennes-le-Château reveals how easily history can be repurposed when mystery is allowed to replace explanation. The village did not create the myth. The myth adopted the village, wrapping ordinary stones in extraordinary meaning. Once that transformation occurred, no amount of documentation could fully undo it. The hill still stands. The church still casts its shadow. And for those inclined to believe, that is enough. Once the myth had a bloodline and a place, it needed something more to feel inevitable. It needed authority that transcended kings and villages, names so luminous that doubt itself would hesitate in their presence. The Priory of Sion could not remain an obscure medieval brotherhood. It had to be guided, century after century, by minds whose brilliance seemed to set them apart from ordinary history. And so a list appeared, presented not as speculation, but as revelation. The great masters of the Priory. The list moved quietly at first, embedded within the secret dossiers, written in the same neutral tone as the genealogies and archival references. It named 27 individuals who allegedly led the Priory across 9 centuries. The effect was immediate and hypnotic. These were not minor nobles or forgotten monks. They were architects of Western culture, figures whose works shaped how humanity understood art, science, and meaning itself. Their inclusion suggested that genius was not random, but curated. Leonardo da Vinci stood at the center of this constellation. His name alone carried enough mystery to power an entire mythology. He wrote in mirror script, filled notebooks with anatomical drawings and impossible machines, and lived outside many conventions of his time. To present him as a secret grandmaster required little explanation. His fascination with symbolism, geometry, and hidden structure made the idea feel almost self-evident. His paintings, especially The Last Supper, were treated not as artworks, but as encrypted texts, their composition scrutinized as if every gesture concealed intent. In this interpretive framework, artistic convention was mistaken for confession. The youthful, androgynous depiction of John the Apostle became Mary Magdalene. The space between figures formed imagined symbols. Balance and symmetry were reinterpreted as deliberate signals to the initiated. Art history, with its understanding of Renaissance aesthetics, was pushed aside in favor of revelation through intuition. Isaac Newton followed, another inspired choice. Known publicly as the architect of classical physics, Newton privately devoted more time to alchemy and biblical chronology than to mathematics. He believed ancient wisdom had been fragmented and hidden, awaiting rediscovery by those capable of understanding it. This alone was enough to pull him into the Priory narrative. His belief that sacred knowledge once existed aligned perfectly with the idea of a hidden lineage protected across centuries. What the myth did not emphasize was that Newton's private studies were not secret in the conspiratorial sense, but eccentric in the scholarly one. He did not hide his writings to protect a bloodline, but because his theological views were heretical and could have cost him his career. The Priory transformed personal obsession into institutional allegiance. Victor Hugo appeared next, a figure of immense cultural authority in 19th century France. He was a political exile, a moral voice, and a man deeply engaged with symbolism and spiritualism. Hugo participated in seances, wrote about hidden forces shaping society, and challenged both monarchy and church. In the Priory narrative, these traits were recast as evidence of initiation. His opposition to power became proof that he served a higher one. The list continued with composers, poets, and philosophers, each selected not for documented secrecy, but for interpretive flexibility. Claude Debussy's music dissolved traditional structure, favoring atmosphere over resolution. That alone made him suitable. Sound itself became symbolic, his harmonies interpreted as coded expressions of ancient truth. Jean Cocteau, a modern artist deeply involved in symbolism and mythic imagery, bridged the ancient and the contemporary. He lived close enough to Plantard's own time to suggest continuity, yet far enough away to avoid contradiction. What unified these figures was not evidence, but ambiguity. Each left behind works that resist singular interpretation. Each occupied a space slightly outside orthodoxy. Each invited speculation. By grouping them together, the Priory myth suggested that genius itself was a symptom of access, that extraordinary creativity flowed from proximity to forbidden truth. This reframing accomplished something subtle and powerful. It inverted the relationship between evidence and belief. Instead of asking whether these individuals belonged to a secret order, believers asked how they could have produced such work without belonging to one. Genius became suspicious. Excellence required explanation beyond talent. The list also served another function. It insulated the myth from political reality. The Priory was never led by reigning kings or generals whose lives were thoroughly documented. It was guided by cultural figures whose private lives contained gaps, contradictions, and emotional intensity. These gaps functioned like open doors. Where records were silent, imagination spoke. Critically, the list evolved. Names shifted between versions, dates adjusted, contradictions appeared. Yet this instability did not weaken belief. It strengthened it. A fixed list could be falsified. A fluid one felt alive, adapting as new interpretations emerged. The Priory began to resemble a living organism rather than a static institution. For historians, the absence of corroboration was decisive. There were no letters referencing leadership roles, no contemporary mentions of the Priory, no financial records, no internal disputes preserved in correspondence. For believers, this absence was confirmation. A perfect secret leaves no trace. What this reveals is less about history and more about narrative gravity. When people encounter greatness, they instinctively search for causes commensurate with effect. A mind like Leonardo's feels too vast to be self-generated. A worldview-shifting theory like Newton's seems to demand ancient roots. The Priory provided an origin myth equal to the outcome. Plantard did not need these figures to have actually participated. He needed them to feel as though they could have. The myth functioned by plausibility rather than proof, by emotional resonance rather than documentation. It spoke to a longing to believe that brilliance is inherited, that meaning is guarded, that history is not an accident, but a design. In the end, the list of great masters did not explain genius, it absorbed it. It gathered scattered lights into a single constellation and named it destiny. And once destiny is invoked, doubt begins to feel like blindness rather than skepticism. By the time the Priory of Sion narrative reached the public, it no longer relied on documents or names alone. It had become something more adaptive, a structure capable of absorbing contradiction without collapsing. This was not an accident. The myth had evolved into a self-sealing system, designed so that every challenge reinforced belief rather than weakened it. At its core was a psychological mechanism older than any archive, one that transforms uncertainty into proof. The system worked by redefining absence as intention. When historians pointed out that no medieval source mentioned the priory explicitly, believers responded that secrecy was its defining feature. When genealogists showed that Plantard's lineage could not be verified, supporters claimed verification was impossible by design. Each missing piece became evidence of successful concealment. Logic folded inward, creating a closed loop in which skepticism itself became confirmation of the truth's power. This dynamic mirrors the structure of medieval heresy trials, where denial was often interpreted as guilt. In both cases, the accused could not win because the rules of interpretation were controlled by belief rather than evidence. The priory myth inverted scholarly reasoning. Instead of asking what survives from the past, it asked what must have been deliberately erased. Language played a crucial role in this inversion. Words like hidden, suppressed, and forbidden carried emotional weight far beyond their literal meaning. They suggested danger, authority, and rebellion all at once. To accept the myth was to feel initiated, to stand apart from the masses who supposedly consumed only sanitized history. Knowledge became identity. Belief was no longer about facts, but about belonging. This sense of initiation was reinforced through interpretation rather than instruction. The myth never presented a single authoritative explanation. Instead, it offered fragments, symbols, and references that required assembly. Books encouraged readers to decode paintings, align maps, and reinterpret scripture. The act of believing became participatory. Each person could feel like a discoverer rather than a follower. Symbols were especially effective. Simple shapes, numbers, and motifs were elevated into keys. A triangle suggested the divine feminine. A pentagram evoked ancient wisdom. A repeated number hinted at sacred chronology. These symbols functioned like mirrors, reflecting whatever meaning the observer brought with them. Because symbols are inherently ambiguous, they resist falsification. One interpretation can always replace another. Art became a favored battleground. Paintings and sculptures were treated as repositories of secret knowledge rather than expressions of cultural context. Perspective, proportion, and composition were read as code. The fact that Renaissance artists studied geometry openly was reframed as evidence of concealed doctrine. The ordinary tools of craftsmanship were recast as conspiratorial instruments. Religion itself was reinterpreted through this lens. Biblical texts were no longer products of theological debate and political compromise, but deliberate misdirections. Councils were portrayed as erasures rather than decisions. Doctrine became censorship. This framing appealed strongly to modern audiences suspicious of institutions. It offered a way to reject authority without abandoning spirituality. The priory myth also benefited from timing. It emerged during a period when trust in traditional narratives was eroding. Political scandals, institutional failures, and rapid social change created a hunger for alternative explanations. People were increasingly willing to believe that official stories were incomplete or manipulated. The myth did not need to convince everyone. It needed only to resonate with those already inclined to doubt. Mass media amplified this resonance. Books popularized the narrative, presenting speculation alongside fact with equal weight. Documentaries used dramatic music and selective imagery to create atmosphere rather than argument. The repetition of claims across formats created familiarity, and familiarity breeds acceptance. Once an idea feels common, it begins to feel true. Importantly, the myth avoided specificity where it mattered most. It named bloodlines but not addresses. It described secrets but not mechanisms. It hinted at influence without detailing how influence was exercised. This vagueness protected it. Specific claims can be tested. General impressions cannot. Critics often underestimated this adaptability. They approached the myth as a historical problem, assuming it could be resolved through evidence. But the myth did not operate in the same domain as history. It functioned as narrative psychology. Its success did not depend on accuracy, but on coherence within its own logic. Within this logic, Pierre Plantard himself became a secondary figure. Once the story gained momentum, his personal credibility mattered less. Even when he was forced to admit under oath that elements of the Priory narrative were fabricated, belief did not collapse. Instead, his confession was reinterpreted as coercion or sacrifice. He became either a fallen guardian or a pawn crushed by larger forces. This is a hallmark of resilient myths. They do not depend on the integrity of their creators. They detach and survive independently. The story of the Priory no longer belonged to Plantard. It belonged to those who had invested meaning in it. What makes this phenomenon unsettling is its familiarity. The same mechanisms appear in political movements, religious revivals, and online communities. A compelling narrative, once internalized, becomes immune to correction. Facts are filtered not for accuracy, but for alignment with identity. The Priory of Sion thus reveals something uncomfortable about the human relationship with history. We do not seek the past only to understand it. We seek it to validate who we are and what we suspect about the world. When history fails to provide that validation, myth steps in. In this sense, the Priory was never really about medieval orders or royal blood. It was about modern anxiety, about the fear that meaning has been lost and must be recovered from somewhere hidden. The myth offered reassurance that beneath confusion lies structure, beneath chaos lies intention. Once that reassurance takes hold, it becomes remarkably difficult to surrender. To let go of the myth would mean accepting that history is shaped by chance as much as design, that brilliance can emerge without secret inheritance, and that institutions may be flawed without being conspiratorial. For many, that acceptance feels colder than belief. And so the myth persists, not because it is true, but because it is useful. The myth held until it encountered a force it could not fully absorb: the slow, procedural machinery of law. Unlike historians, courts do not interpret absence as intention. They require statements, signatures, admissions. In the early 1990s, the Priory of Sion story drifted out of libraries and into a legal setting where narrative elegance mattered less than accountability. The transition exposed the fragile seams beneath the layered illusion. Pierre Plantard had lived comfortably in ambiguity for decades, allowing others to amplify his claims while he remained just distant enough to deny specifics. That balance collapsed when he was summoned in connection with a separate legal dispute involving property and inheritance. To support his position, Plantard invoked his supposed royal descent, presenting himself as a legitimate claimant grounded in the very genealogy he had spent years cultivating. This time, the claim was not symbolic. It carried legal consequences. Under oath, the protections of myth evaporated. Courts are immune to mystique. They are interested in verifiable lineage, documented continuity, and sworn truth. Faced with the demand to substantiate his ancestry, Plantard was cornered by his own creation. The genealogies that had functioned so powerfully in books and documentaries could not withstand forensic scrutiny. Pressed by magistrates, Plantard conceded what historians had long suspected. He admitted that the Priory of Sion, as described in the dossiers, was a fabrication. The documents had been planted. The lists had been invented. The lineage was imaginary. The admission was not dramatic. It was procedural, recorded in legal language, stripped of narrative flourish. In that sterile environment, the myth lost its voice. For scholars, the confession should have ended the story. It provided what decades of analysis had pointed toward, confirmation from the source himself. Yet, outside the courtroom, the impact was muted. The confession did not circulate with the same intensity as the myth. It lacked atmosphere, symbolism, and emotional charge. It was not a story people wanted to tell. Believers responded predictably. Some dismissed the admission as coercion, suggesting Plantard had been threatened or silenced. Others argued that he had lied to protect the true secret, sacrificing his reputation to preserve the greater truth. In this reframing, even confession became part of the plan. The myth adjusted, incorporating its own exposure. This reaction reveals the final evolution of the Priory narrative. It no longer depended on evidence at all. It had become a belief system capable of metabolizing contradiction. Facts were no longer tools of evaluation, but raw material for reinterpretation. The story survived not because it was defended, but because it was insulated. Meanwhile, independent researchers dismantled the technical foundations of the myth. Chemical analysis of inks demonstrated modern composition. Paper fibers revealed inconsistent dating. Handwriting comparisons showed patterns linking supposedly centuries-old documents to 20th century creators. The techniques that once seemed masterful were exposed as clever but imperfect. These findings circulated within academic circles, published in specialized journals, and presented at conferences. They mattered greatly to historians, but little to the broader public. The myth had already migrated beyond the reach of peer review. It lived in popular books, travel guides, and online forums, where emotional resonance outweighed methodological rigor. The contrast between the quiet certainty of scholarship and the theatrical persistence of belief was striking. One relied on accumulation of evidence, cautious language, and revision. The other thrived on implication, mystery, and repetition. In the contest for attention, the latter held a natural advantage. Rennes-le-Château continued to receive visitors. Tours still narrated hidden meanings. Souvenir shops sold books that treated discredited claims as unresolved puzzles. The village itself, indifferent to ideology, benefited economically from its association with secrecy. Myth, once established, had practical momentum. What ultimately emerged from the collapse of the Priory narrative was not disappointment, but displacement. The structure of belief remained intact, even as its original content weakened. New theories filled the space. Other bloodlines, other secret orders, other hidden histories replaced the old. The pattern endured. This persistence suggests that the Priory of Sion was never truly about medieval France or forgotten dynasties. It was a template, a way of seeing the world that privileges concealment over contingency and design over accident. Once learned, This way of seeing does not easily unlearn itself. The legal exposure did achieve one thing. It clarified the historical record. For those willing to accept it, the priory was a modern invention, crafted by individuals driven by ambition, insecurity, and imagination. It was not ancient, it was not sacred, it was not real in the way it claimed to be. Yet even this clarity carries a deeper lesson. The success of the priory myth demonstrates how vulnerable historical understanding becomes when it is filtered through desire rather than discipline. Archives can be manipulated, symbols can be reinterpreted endlessly, authority can be mimicked convincingly. In the end, the courtroom did not destroy the myth, it revealed its nature. The Priory of Sion was not a secret society hidden within history. It was a story hidden within belief, sustained not by evidence, but by the human need for significance beneath the surface of things. Once that need is acknowledged, the myth no longer appears anomalous. It appears inevitable. After the legal admissions and scholarly dismantling, the story should have faded into footnotes, a cautionary tale taught in seminars about historical method and forgery. Instead, it entered a second life, more influential than the first. Freed from the need to defend itself as fact, the narrative reinvented itself as possibility. It no longer insisted on being true. It only needed to feel plausible. This transition marked a crucial shift. When a claim presents itself as history, it can be tested and refuted. When it presents itself as an open question, it becomes immune. The priory narrative learned to speak in the language of suggestion rather than assertion. Phrases like, "some believe," "it is rumored," and "what if" replaced definitive statements. Certainty dissolved into atmosphere, and atmosphere proved far more durable. Popular culture became the new archive. Novels blended documented history with speculative interpretation, deliberately blurring boundaries. Churches and paintings were repurposed as narrative devices. The idea that art conceals truth beneath surface beauty felt intuitive in an age accustomed to hidden algorithms and encrypted communication. Mystery became modern rather than medieval. This shift did not depend on belief in a literal bloodline. Readers could engage the story symbolically, emotionally, or aesthetically. The idea of a suppressed feminine principle within Christianity resonated with contemporary conversations about power, gender, and exclusion. Mary Magdalene was reimagined not as a repentant sinner, but as a silenced partner. Whether historically accurate or not, the image fulfilled a cultural desire for revision. The priory myth thus detached itself from Pierre Plantard entirely. His motivations, admissions, and personal failures became irrelevant. The story no longer required a founder. It circulated as a cultural artifact, passed from author to audience, each adding interpretation without responsibility for origin. In this form, it was no longer a hoax. It was a narrative ecosystem. This ecosystem thrived online. Forums dissected symbols with collective enthusiasm. Amateur researchers overlaid maps with geometric patterns, tracing lines that linked churches, mountains, and ancient ruins. Software replaced parchment. Digital tools gave the illusion of precision, turning intuition into diagrams that looked scientific without adhering to scientific method. The appeal lay in agency. Participants felt like investigators rather than consumers. They did not merely read the story, they extended it. Each new connection, however tenuous, generated a sense of contribution. The myth functioned as a collaborative puzzle with no final solution, ensuring perpetual engagement. Meanwhile, academic critiques struggled to gain traction outside specialist circles. Their conclusions were cautious, conditional, and restrained. They acknowledged uncertainty, emphasized probability, and rejected sensationalism. In a media environment optimized for impact, such language sounded weak. Nuance lost to confidence, silence lost to spectacle. The narrative also benefited from a broader cultural shift toward suspicion. Institutions once trusted to curate truth had faltered visibly. Political scandals, corporate deception, and historical revisionism created an environment where skepticism felt virtuous. The Priory story offered a framework for that skepticism, suggesting that all official narratives might conceal uncomfortable realities. Importantly, it did so without demanding commitment. One could entertain the idea without accepting it fully. Curiosity replaced faith. This lowered the cost of engagement and expanded the audience. The story became a lens rather than a doctrine. Tourism adapted accordingly. Rennes-le-Château no longer promised answers, only intrigue. Guides spoke in conditional tones, inviting visitors to draw their own conclusions. The village became a physical metaphor for the myth itself, ordinary at its core, extraordinary by interpretation. What emerged from this phase was a recognition that the Priory of Sion had become a modern myth in the classical sense. Like ancient myths, it explained not events but anxieties. It addressed fears about manipulation, loss of meaning, and exclusion from power. It offered a hidden order in a world that felt increasingly opaque. In this sense, debunking was beside the point. Myths are not sustained by evidence, but by relevance. The Priory narrative adapted because it spoke to contemporary concerns, not medieval realities. It did not survive despite being false. It survived because falsity no longer mattered. This does not mean truth became irrelevant. It means truth competed on uneven ground. Historical truth is complex, provisional, and often unsatisfying. Myth offers coherence, intention, and drama. When presented with both, many choose the latter, not out of ignorance, but out of preference. The endurance of the Priory story thus reveals a paradox. Exposure did not weaken it, it refined it. Stripped of factual claims, it emerged as a narrative of suspicion, a template for reimagining history as a coded text awaiting interpretation. Whether this represents intellectual freedom or a retreat from discipline depends on perspective. What is clear is that the story's power no longer resides in archives or courts. It resides in imagination, where it continues to evolve, unburdened by the need to be proven. In that space, the Priory of Sion is no longer something that either existed or did not exist. It is something that happens again and again, whenever mystery feels more satisfying than explanation. What lingered after the myth detached from its origins was not belief in a single story, but a new way of reading the world. The Priory of Sion had trained its audience to see history not as a record, but as a palimpsest, a surface scraped and rewritten so many times that truth could only exist beneath layers of erasure. Once that habit of thought takes hold, it does not confine itself to one legend. It spreads. Churches became suspect by default. Their stones were no longer merely old. They were assumed to be selective. Architectural choices once explained by engineering or aesthetics were reframed as concealment. A missing document was no longer a loss, but a deliberate removal. Silence itself became the loudest clue. This shift marked a fundamental change in how authority was perceived. Institutions were no longer guardians of memory, but potential jailers of truth. In this environment, expertise lost its privileged position. The historian's caution, once a mark of rigor, began to look like evasion. Certainty spoken softly was overshadowed by speculation spoken loudly. The idea that knowledge requires training gave way to the belief that insight belongs to anyone willing to look differently. Interpretation became democratized, untethered from methodology. This transformation did not arise from ignorance. Many who embraced alternative readings were well-read, articulate, and curious. Their rejection of official narratives was not anti-intellectual, but post-institutional. They did not distrust thinking. They distrusted gatekeepers. The Priory story validated that distrust by offering an example, however fabricated, of how easily archives could be manipulated and how confidently experts could be misled. Once accepted, this logic extended outward. Other hidden histories were proposed: suppressed technologies, erased civilizations, secret lineages. Each followed the same structure: fragments assembled into coherence, absence reframed as evidence, and skepticism absorbed as confirmation. The success of the Priory myth provided a blueprint. What made this blueprint powerful was its emotional efficiency. It replaced complexity with intention. Randomness is unsettling. It suggests that suffering, brilliance, and collapse may have no deeper reason. A hidden order, even a sinister one, offers comfort. It implies that someone is in control, that chaos is curated rather than meaningless. The Priory narrative also appealed to a sense of moral elevation. To reject official history was to position oneself as independent, awake, unfooled. Belief became an act of resistance rather than submission. This moral framing insulated the narrative from critique. Disagreement could be dismissed as complicity or naivety. Ironically, the myth's exposure contributed to this effect. The revelation that documents had been forged did not undermine confidence in alternative history. It undermined confidence in verification itself. If even archives could be compromised, then nothing was secure. In that vacuum, intuition gained authority. This reorientation had consequences for how the past was engaged. Instead of asking what most likely happened given available evidence, people asked what might have happened given perceived motives. Intent replaced probability. Suspicion replaced context. The past became a crime scene rather than a landscape. Yet this mode of thinking carried risks. When every absence is interpreted as concealment, the distinction between skepticism and paranoia erodes. Not every gap is a plot. Not every silence is deliberate. History is incomplete because human record-keeping is fragile, not because truth is always hunted. The Priory myth blurred that distinction. It trained its audience to favor the extraordinary explanation over the mundane. This preference shaped expectations. Official accounts felt insufficient not because they were wrong, but because they were untheatrical. They lacked drama. At the same time, the myth exposed a genuine weakness in historical communication. Academic narratives often fail to convey uncertainty honestly. They present conclusions without showing the scaffolding of doubt beneath them. In doing so, they create the impression of certainty that later revelations can shatter. When confidence collapses, trust collapses with it. The Priory story exploited this vulnerability. By dramatizing the possibility of hidden truth, it filled an emotional gap left by institutional reticence. It suggested that history was not finished, that discovery remained possible, even for outsiders. This is why the myth persists not as a claim, but as a posture. It encourages perpetual reinterpretation. No answer is final. No conclusion closes the case. Meaning remains just out of reach, always recoverable with one more connection, one more alignment, one more insight. Such a posture can be intellectually stimulating, but it can also become corrosive. Without standards of evidence, interpretation loses its anchor. Patterns emerge everywhere. Coincidence becomes design. The world transforms into a puzzle without edges. The Priory of Sion, in its final form, did not ask people to believe in a medieval order. It taught them to suspect surfaces. It suggested that truth is never where it claims to be. That lesson, once learned, is difficult to unlearn. Whether this represents liberation or loss depends on how it is handled. Curiosity can coexist with discipline. Doubt can sharpen understanding rather than dissolve it. But when mystery becomes an end rather than a means, understanding stalls. The legacy of the Priory myth is therefore not historical confusion, but epistemological shift. It altered how many people decide what to trust, how they weigh evidence, and where they locate meaning. Long after the documents were discredited, that shift remained. In the quiet aftermath, the myth left behind no secret order, no royal bloodline, no hidden treasure. What it left behind was a habit of mind, a lens through which history itself now appears suspect, layered, and endlessly open to reinvention. As the Priory of Sion dissolved into a broader culture of suspicion, its most enduring influence emerged not in libraries or tourist sites, but in the way belief itself began to reorganize. The story revealed that modern myths no longer require temples or priests. They require only circulation. Repeated often enough, framed carefully enough, an idea gains weight through familiarity rather than verification. In this sense, the Priory was not an anomaly. It was a prototype. What distinguished it from earlier legends was its relationship with modern media. Medieval myths spread slowly, changing shape over generations. The Priory narrative moved at the speed of printing, then television, then digital networks. Each medium stripped away context while amplifying emotion. Complexity was flattened. Suggestion replaced argument. The story became modular, adaptable to different audiences without losing its core appeal. This adaptability allowed the myth to intersect with other narratives seamlessly. Ideas about secret gospels, suppressed female authority, lost civilizations, and hidden technologies began to merge. The Priory became a node within a larger constellation of alternative histories, each reinforcing the others through shared assumptions. If one secret could be hidden, why not many? This convergence created a feedback loop. Exposure to one alternative narrative primed individuals to accept others. Skepticism toward official history became a general posture rather than a specific critique. Trust shifted away from institutions and toward intuition, personal research, and community consensus. Truth became something felt rather than demonstrated. The emotional appeal of this shift cannot be overstated. It offered empowerment. To believe that one could uncover what experts missed was intoxicating. Research became a form of identity construction. Forums and discussion groups functioned as initiatory spaces where newcomers learned the language, symbols, and interpretive habits of the community. Agreement signaled belonging. Within these spaces, dissent was subtly discouraged. Skeptical voices were framed as closed-minded or compromised. Nuance was interpreted as hesitation. The myth did not enforce belief through authority, but through culture. To question the framework itself risked social exclusion. At the same time, the Priory story exposed a paradox at the heart of modern knowledge. The more information became available, the harder it became to evaluate. Abundance overwhelmed discernment. In this environment, narratives that offered coherence, even false coherence, felt stabilizing. They organized chaos into story. The academic response struggled to adapt. Scholars continued to publish careful refutations, but these operated within a system that valued precision over persuasion. Their conclusions were correct, but their delivery lacked resonance. In contrast, the Priory myth spoke in the language of revelation. It did not explain. It unveiled. This imbalance revealed a communication gap. Expertise assumed trust. Myth cultivated desire. When trust eroded, desire filled the vacuum. The result was not a rejection of knowledge, but a redefinition of it. Knowledge became personal, experiential, and provisional. The legacy of the Priory also reshaped how evidence was perceived. Documents were no longer neutral artifacts. They were potential instruments of manipulation. Provenance mattered less than implication. A fragment could outweigh a complete record if it felt more meaningful. This inversion challenged the foundations of historical reasoning, yet the story also forced historians to confront uncomfortable truths about their discipline. Archives are not innocent. They reflect power, survival, and selection. Voices are lost not only by accident, but by design. While the Priory exaggerated this reality into conspiracy, it did so by exploiting a genuine tension between memory and authority. In this way, the myth functioned as both distortion and critique. It misrepresented the past while highlighting the fragility of its transmission. It reminded audiences that history is constructed from what remains, not from what was. That insight, stripped of paranoia, remains valid. The danger arises when that insight is absolutized. When all history is treated as suspect, understanding collapses into relativism. If every narrative is manipulation, then no narrative can be corrected. Power shifts from evidence to charisma, from method to momentum. The Priory of Sion did not create this condition, but it exemplified it. Its rise and persistence demonstrated how easily stories can outpace scrutiny when they align with emotional need. It showed that debunking alone is insufficient. What matters is replacing myth with meaning, not merely negating it. As the story faded from headlines, its influence diffused quietly. It shaped how future narratives would be received and constructed. It trained audiences to look for codes, to expect concealment, to distrust closure. Even those who rejected its claims absorbed its posture. In the end, the Priory myth leaves behind an ambiguous inheritance. It stands as a cautionary example of fabrication, a lesson in how history can be manipulated. But it also exposes a hunger that remains unmet, the desire for depth, connection, and significance in the past. Until that hunger is addressed honestly, myths will continue to arise, not because people are foolish, but because they are searching. The Priory of Sion was never the answer. It was a symptom. Beneath the layers of forgery, speculation, and cultural obsession, The Priory of Sion narrative exposes something quieter and more persistent than deception: the human need to reconcile history with meaning. Facts alone rarely satisfy that need. Dates, documents, and verified events explain what happened, but they often fail to explain why it matters. Into that gap, myths inevitably flow. The success of the Priory story rested on its ability to re-enchant the past. Modern historical practice, shaped by Enlightenment rationality, strips events of mystery in favor of causality. This approach produces clarity, but it also produces distance. The past becomes an object of study rather than a living presence. The Priory reversed that relationship. It invited people to feel history rather than understand it. In doing so, it tapped into a pattern as old as civilization. Ancient societies encoded meaning through lineage, sacred kingship, and hidden knowledge. Authority flowed through blood and ritual rather than bureaucracy. By resurrecting these ideas within a modern framework, the Priory narrative made the past emotionally legible again. It suggested continuity, where modern life feels fragmented. The appeal of royal bloodlines illustrates this clearly. Hereditary descent offers a tangible link between generations. It implies purpose rather than randomness. To imagine that greatness or spiritual authority is inherited feels stabilizing in a world where identity often feels provisional. The Priory myth transformed genealogy into destiny. This transformation also addressed a deeper spiritual tension. Institutional religion, particularly in the West, had lost moral authority for many. Scandals, dogmatism, and rigidity alienated those seeking transcendence without hierarchy. The Priory offered spirituality without obedience, mystery without submission. It suggested that sacred truth existed independently of institutions, guarded by those worthy of it. Mary Magdalene's reimagining exemplified this shift. Whether historically justified or not, her elevation symbolized a correction, a restoration of balance. She became an emblem of suppressed voices and lost dimensions of faith. The myth did not ask whether this portrayal was accurate. It asked whether it felt just. In this sense, the Priory functioned less as history and more as allegory. Its symbols resonated because they addressed contemporary concerns: exclusion, authority, and the desire for reconciliation between intellect and intuition. The story endured not because it convinced, but because it comforted. Yet comfort carries cost. When narrative satisfaction replaces evidence, critical boundaries blur. The Priory story demonstrated how easily emotional coherence can masquerade as truth. Its elegance concealed its emptiness. It offered meaning without accountability, mystery without method. This dynamic mirrors the structure of religious belief itself, which relies on trust, tradition, and interpretation. The difference lies in self-awareness. Faith traditions often acknowledge their symbolic nature. The Priory myth presented symbolism as fact, collapsing metaphor into assertion. The danger of this collapse is subtle. It does not produce immediate falsehoods so much as a gradual erosion of discernment. Once people learn to privilege resonance over reliability, they become vulnerable to any narrative that feels profound. Depth becomes a feeling rather than a measure. At the same time, dismissing such narratives outright risks missing what they reveal. The popularity of the Priory story indicates dissatisfaction with how history is communicated. It suggests that audiences crave narratives that integrate emotion, identity, and transcendence. The failure lies not only with mythmakers, but with institutions that neglect these dimensions. Historians often speak in the language of probability and revision. This honesty is essential, but it can feel anticlimactic. When history is presented as provisional, audiences may seek certainty elsewhere. The Priory offered certainty, even if it was false. The challenge, then, is not merely to debunk myths, but to tell better truths. Truths that acknowledge uncertainty without abandoning meaning. Truths that recognize the symbolic power of the past without surrendering to fantasy. The Priory myth succeeded where history faltered because it spoke to the whole person. As the story recedes into cultural memory, its shape dissolves, but its influence remains. It has altered expectations. Audiences now approach history with a heightened sensitivity to omission and power. This sensitivity can sharpen inquiry or distort it, depending on how it is guided. In its final analysis, the Priory of Sion stands as neither pure fiction nor misunderstood fact. It is a mirror reflecting how modern society negotiates knowledge and belief. It reveals a longing for connection across time, for assurance that the past holds answers to present uncertainty. The myth did not restore that connection. It simulated it. And yet, the simulation was convincing enough to endure. What remains is the task of understanding why. Not to condemn belief, but to comprehend it. Not to mock curiosity, but to channel it responsibly. History does not need to be stripped of wonder to remain true. But wonder must be anchored, or it drifts. The Priory of Sion drifted far from its origins. In doing so, it illuminated both the fragility of historical truth and the resilience of human imagination. That illumination, stripped of illusion, may be its only genuine legacy. As the Priory of Sion receded from public certainty into cultural memory, it left behind a quieter but more consequential transformation. It altered how stories about the past are evaluated. The question was no longer whether a claim could be proven, but whether it felt like it explained something missing. In this way, the Priory became a threshold myth, marking the point where historical curiosity crossed into interpretive hunger. This hunger did not emerge from nowhere. The 20th century dismantled many inherited narratives. Empires collapsed, ideologies failed, and institutions once assumed permanent revealed their fragility. Progress, once imagined as linear and benevolent, began to feel erratic. In that environment, history lost its reassuring arc. It no longer guaranteed meaning. The Priory story stepped into that absence, offering not progress but continuity, not improvement but preservation. Continuity carries emotional power. It suggests that something essential survives disruption, that beneath surface change lies an unbroken thread. The Priory framed itself as that thread, weaving through wars, schisms, and revolutions untouched. Whether real or not was secondary. The idea itself answered a psychological need. This need shaped how evidence was consumed. Instead of asking whether sources were independent, audiences asked whether they aligned. Confirmation replaced corroboration. A document's value lay in how well it fit the story, not in how securely it was dated or sourced. In this environment, interpretation became an act of loyalty rather than inquiry. The rise of visual media intensified this shift. Images bypass analysis and speak directly to intuition. Photographs of churches, paintings, and landscapes circulated with captions implying hidden meaning. Context dissolved. A carving became a clue. A shadow became intention. Once images were detached from explanation, they became infinitely reusable. This visual economy favored myths like the Priory. Its symbols were portable. A pentagram, a rose, a chalice could appear anywhere and carry significance. The meaning was not fixed. It was activated by belief. This flexibility ensured survival. A rigid doctrine would have collapsed under scrutiny. A symbolic network adapted. What emerged was not a belief system, but a style of thinking. This style privileges pattern over process, resonance over rigor. It treats history as a coded message rather than a record of human action. The past becomes a puzzle designed to be solved rather than a landscape to be understood. This shift has consequences. When history is approached primarily as encryption, human agency fades. People become placeholders in a design rather than actors navigating circumstance. Violence, compromise, and error lose explanatory power. Everything becomes intentional, directed by hidden hands. The Priory myth encouraged this flattening. Kings ruled not because of politics or force, but because of blood. Artists created not through struggle or context, but through access to secret knowledge. Complexity collapsed into destiny. This made the story elegant, but also misleading. At the same time, the myth revealed a dissatisfaction with reductionism. Purely material explanations often feel insufficient. They explain how, but not why. The Priory offered a metaphysical dimension, however fabricated, that restored a sense of depth to history. It suggested that ideas matter, that symbols shape reality, that belief can influence events. The challenge lies in distinguishing symbolic truth from factual truth. Symbols can illuminate without being literal. Myths can convey values without being histories. The Priory blurred this distinction, presenting allegory as archive. In doing so, it invited confusion. Yet that confusion persists because it is productive. It generates conversation, exploration, and engagement. People drawn to the Priory were not passive consumers. They read, traveled, debated, and connected. The myth activated curiosity even as it misdirected it. This raises an uncomfortable question for historians and educators. If false narratives inspire deeper engagement than accurate ones, what does that say about how truth is presented? The Priory did not succeed because people rejected history. It succeeded because it made history feel alive. The solution is not to compete with spectacle, but to reclaim narrative without surrendering discipline. History contains enough drama, contradiction, and wonder on its own. It does not need hidden orders to be meaningful. It needs to be told in ways that honor both evidence and experience. The Priory of Sion, in its final form, stands as a reminder that stories do not need to be true to be influential. They need only to align with emotional expectation. Once they do, correction becomes secondary. As time passes, the specific claims of the Priory will continue to fade. New myths will replace old ones, but the underlying dynamic remains. The tension between explanation and enchantment, between rigor and resonance, defines how societies remember. The Priory did not corrupt history. It exposed a vulnerability within it. It showed that when meaning is not offered responsibly, it will be invented recklessly. In that sense, the story's ultimate lesson is not about forgery or belief. It is about responsibility. How the past is framed shapes how the present understands itself. When history is reduced to data, Myth will restore poetry. When myth overwhelms fact, understanding dissolves. Between those extremes lies a narrow path. The Priory of Sion wandered far from it. But in doing so, it illuminated where the path lies, and why it matters to keep it in sight. With distance, the Priory of Sion can be seen less as a singular deception and more as a symptom of a deeper fracture between knowledge and trust. It emerged at a moment when certainty felt dangerous and authority felt compromised. In that climate, the promise of hidden truth carried more weight than openly argued fact. The myth did not overthrow history, it sidestepped it. This sidestepping reshaped expectations. Audiences no longer demanded proof in the traditional sense. They demanded coherence, symbolism, and moral alignment. A story that felt internally consistent and emotionally satisfying could compete with, and often surpass, one grounded in documentation. The Priory narrative excelled at this because it offered a world where injustice was explained, suppression had purpose, and forgotten figures were redeemed. Redemption played a central role. The myth rehabilitated those history had marginalized or simplified. Mary Magdalene became more than a biblical footnote. The Merovingians became more than barbarian kings. Even Pierre Plantard, when exposed, was reimagined by some as tragic rather than fraudulent. Each figure was lifted out of banality and placed into a drama of concealment and recovery. This process mirrors how collective memory often operates. Societies revisit the past not to preserve it unchanged, but to renegotiate its meaning. What differs in the case of the Priory is the absence of restraint. Symbolic reinterpretation was presented as historical correction. Allegory was mistaken for archive. The myth also benefited from its ability to personalize history. It suggested that lineage, initiation, and proximity mattered more than institutions. Power flowed through people, not systems. This appealed to individuals who felt alienated from bureaucratic authority. The idea that truth survives in bloodlines or secret communities resonated in a world dominated by abstraction. At the same time, the Priory narrative flattened complexity. Historical actors became pawns in a larger design. Political struggles, economic pressures, and cultural shifts were subordinated to a single hidden motive. This reduction made the story easier to grasp but less accurate. It replaced messy causality with elegant intention. Yet elegance has its own seduction. A story that explains everything feels complete. It offers closure without resolution. The Priory provided such closure by implying that confusion itself was part of the plan. In doing so, it transformed uncertainty from a problem into a feature. This transformation altered how doubt functioned. Doubt no longer led to investigation. It led to deeper belief. Every unanswered question reinforced the sense of concealment. The myth thus inverted the traditional relationship between inquiry and conclusion. The broader cultural impact of this inversion is still unfolding. It has influenced how conspiracy narratives are constructed and consumed. Many contemporary theories follow the same pattern: selective evidence, symbolic interpretation, and a self-sealing logic that reframes criticism as hostility. The Priory served as an early rehearsal for this structure. Importantly, this does not mean its audience lacked critical thinking. Rather, critical thinking was redirected. Skepticism targeted institutions rather than claims. Analysis focused on motives rather than methods. This shift allowed elaborate narratives to flourish without meeting traditional standards of proof. The challenge posed by the Priory is therefore not how to prevent myths from forming, but how to engage the needs they address. People turn to hidden histories when official ones feel incomplete or dismissive. They seek stories that acknowledge injustice, complexity, and mystery. History, when communicated narrowly, can appear indifferent to these needs. Its caution may feel like coldness. Its revisions may feel like evasions. The Priory exploited this perception by offering warmth and certainty in equal measure. The task for those who care about truth is not to extinguish myth, but to contextualize it, to show where symbolism enriches understanding and where it misleads, to acknowledge gaps without filling them irresponsibly, to invite curiosity without surrendering discipline. The Priory of Sion ultimately failed as history, but succeeded as narrative. It reminded audiences that the past is not inert. It is constantly reinterpreted through present concerns. That process is unavoidable. What matters is how it is guided. If myths are inevitable, then responsibility lies in shaping myths that do not distort beyond recognition. Myths that inspire inquiry rather than replace it. Stories that honor complexity rather than erase it. Seen this way, the Priory is less a warning about deception and more a lesson about communication. It shows what happens when the human hunger for meaning outpaces the structures designed to provide it. When that hunger is ignored, it will feed on whatever is available. The myth promised access to something lost. In truth, what was lost was trust. Trust in institutions, trust in narratives, trust that history could speak honestly without spectacle. The Priory filled that void temporarily, but at the cost of clarity. As the story continues to fade, its imprint remains. It has shaped how questions are asked, how answers are judged, and how authority is perceived. These effects persist long after the documents are dismissed. In the end, the Priory of Sion leaves behind neither secret masters nor sacred bloodlines. It leaves behind a reminder that truth does not exist in isolation. It must be communicated, contextualized, and cared for. Otherwise, it will be replaced by something more alluring. In the end, when the noise recedes and the symbols lose their urgency, the Priory of Sion leaves behind a silence that feels heavier than revelation. It is the silence of recognizing that the past does not owe us coherence. History does not arrange itself into narratives that flatter our hopes or resolve our doubts. It is uneven, fragmented, and often indifferent to meaning. The myth attempted to correct that indifference by imposing intention where none could be proven. What made the Priory compelling was not its claims, but its tone. It spoke with certainty about uncertainty. It treated absence as presence and mystery as inheritance. In doing so, it trained its audience to value depth over accuracy, atmosphere over accountability. That training did not end with the myth's exposure. It carried forward into how many people now approach information itself. Once the habit is formed, it spreads easily. News becomes suspect. Expertise becomes performative. Every explanation is weighed not by its evidence, but by its perceived motive. The Priory myth did not invent this habit, but it normalized it. It showed how satisfying it can feel to believe that nothing is accidental and no silence is innocent. Yet there is a quieter truth that emerges when the myth is finally set aside. The past is not less meaningful because it lacks secret orders. It is more meaningful because it was shaped by ordinary people acting under extraordinary pressure. Kings ruled and failed. Priests sinned and struggled. Artists created within constraints they did not choose. Their lives were not orchestrated by hidden masters, but by circumstance, ambition, fear, and faith. The Merovingians do not need sacred blood to be fascinating. They lived at the edge of a collapsing world, balancing pagan tradition and Christian transformation. Their story is one of survival and adaptation, not concealment. Mary Magdalene does not need a secret marriage to matter. Her presence in early Christian tradition already challenges simplistic narratives about authority and devotion. Rennes-le-Château does not need buried parchments to be human. It tells a story of poverty, ambition, and exploitation within a rigid institution. Béranger Saunière was not a guardian of cosmic truth, but a flawed individual navigating temptation and consequence. That story is less glamorous, but it is real. The Priory myth replaced these realities with a single organizing fantasy. In doing so, it flattened history into allegory. Allegory has its place, but when mistaken for fact, it distorts rather than deepens understanding. The danger lies not in imagination, but in forgetting where imagination ends. There is a responsibility that comes with storytelling, especially about the past. Stories shape memory, and memory shapes identity. When history is presented as a puzzle designed to deceive, trust erodes. When trust erodes, dialogue collapses. What remains is suspicion masquerading as insight. The Priory of Sion demonstrated how easily that collapse can occur. It required no mass deception, only patience and narrative fluency. A few planted documents, a compelling lineage, a resonant theme. The rest was supplied by the audience, eager to participate in discovery rather than acceptance. This participation felt empowering, but it carried a cost. It replaced shared standards with personal conviction. Once truth becomes individualized, correction becomes intrusion. At that point, belief no longer seeks understanding. It seeks reinforcement. What ultimately dissolves the myth is not exposure, but exhaustion. Endless interpretation leads nowhere. Symbols lose clarity when overused. Mystery loses force when everything is mysterious. Gradually, the narrative collapses under its own weight, not through refutation, but through saturation. In that collapse lies an opportunity to return to history not as a code to be broken, but as a record to be interpreted carefully and humbly, to accept uncertainty without converting it into conspiracy, to allow the past to remain incomplete without demanding that incompleteness hide intention. The Priory of Sion was a mirror held up to modern longing. It reflected distrust, curiosity, and a desire for depth. Those impulses are not wrong. They become dangerous only when severed from discipline. Wonder without method becomes illusion. History does not need to compete with myth by becoming sensational. It needs to reclaim narrative without abandoning rigor. It needs to show how meaning arises from context, conflict, and continuity, not from hidden hands. When that work is done well, myth loses its monopoly on enchantment. The story ends not with revelation, but with recognition. The Priory of Sion was never an ancient order guarding sacred blood. It was a modern construction guarding a feeling, the feeling that the world makes sense beneath the surface. That feeling is powerful, but it does not require deception to survive. What remains is the choice of how to engage the past, to treat it as an adversary hiding truth, or as a fragile inheritance shaped by human limits. The latter offers less drama, but more honesty. And in the long run, honesty is the only foundation strong enough to hold meaning without secrecy. When the last echoes of the Priory of Sion finally fade, what remains is not a solved mystery, but a clarified landscape. The fog lifts not because a hidden truth is revealed, but because the need for one begins to loosen its grip. The story ends where it always should have ended. Not in secrecy, but in perspective. The Priory myth promised that history had been stolen, edited by unseen hands, and locked away from the uninitiated. That promise carried emotional force because it mirrored a modern experience. Many people feel disconnected from institutions that claim authority over knowledge. The idea that truth is hidden rather than lost transforms alienation into insight. It makes exclusion feel purposeful instead of arbitrary. Yet the deeper reality is more ordinary and more difficult to accept. History is not hidden. It is incomplete. It is shaped by survival, chance, power, and neglect. Archives are not vaults designed to deceive. They are remnants shaped by what endured long enough to be recorded. Silence is not always suppression. Often, it is simply absence. The Priory of Sion collapsed these distinctions. It taught its audience to read every gap as a cover-up, every inconsistency as design. Over time, this way of thinking becomes reflexive. It no longer asks whether an explanation is likely, only whether it feels profound. Depth becomes aesthetic rather than analytical. This is where the myth's true danger lies. Not in false claims about medieval orders, but in the habit of replacing method with mood. When belief becomes an emotional posture rather than a reasoned conclusion, correction feels like attack. At that point, dialogue ends and narratives harden. Yet the same story also reveals something hopeful. People were drawn to the Priory because they wanted history to matter. They wanted connection across time, continuity of meaning, and reassurance that human experience is not random or disposable. These desires are legitimate. They do not require fabrication to be fulfilled. The real past is already filled with wonder. Dynasties rise and fall through fragile alliances. Beliefs reshape empires. Individuals leave traces that outlast their intentions. The Merovingians lived at the edge of myth because they inhabited a world in transition, not because they guarded divine blood. Their story is compelling precisely because it is human, unstable, and unresolved. Mary Magdalene matters not because she was secretly royal, but because her presence in early tradition exposes how memory is shaped by authority. Her marginalization tells us more about institutional fear than any hidden marriage ever could. That truth is quieter, but it is real. Rennes-le-Château does not need buried parchments to be instructive. It shows how charisma, secrecy, and money can intertwine within rigid systems. It reminds us that myth often grows where transparency fails. These lessons are grounded, verifiable, and still unsettling. The Priory myth offered a shortcut to meaning. It bypassed complexity and delivered certainty wrapped in mystery. But meaning earned through shortcuts does not last. It requires constant reinforcement, constant reinterpretation, constant defense. Eventually, it exhausts itself. What replaces it is not emptiness, but responsibility. Responsibility to distinguish between symbol and evidence. responsibility to accept uncertainty without transforming it into suspicion, responsibility to tell stories that engage imagination without abandoning truth. The collapse of the Priory narrative does not signal the end of myth-making. New stories will emerge, shaped by new anxieties. The pattern will repeat. What can change is how those stories are met. With curiosity, yes, but also with discipline, with openness, but also with care. History does not need to be purified of imagination. It needs imagination to be guided. Symbols can illuminate without misleading. Narratives can inspire without deceiving. Wonder can coexist with rigor. The Priory of Sion ultimately failed because it confused these boundaries. It treated feeling as fact and metaphor as proof. In doing so, it revealed how fragile trust becomes when those distinctions blur. The final lesson is not about rejecting mystery, but about placing it where it belongs. Mystery is an invitation to inquiry, not a substitute for it. When inquiry stops, mystery becomes dogma. As this story closes, there is no secret order revealed, no final cipher decoded, no hidden lineage restored. There is only a clearer understanding of why such stories take hold and what they demand in return. The past does not whisper secrets to those who look hard enough. It speaks unevenly, through fragments and contradictions. Listening to it requires patience more than suspicion, humility more than certainty. That may feel less dramatic than hidden masters and sacred bloodlines, but it offers something stronger, a way to engage history without surrendering judgment, and to find meaning without inventing shadows to hold it.